The text message came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, while I was eating toast at my kitchen table in Kelowna. I remember that detail because I'd just poured my second cup of coffee, the good kind, dark roast from the shop on Bernard Avenue that my wife used to love, and I was reading the weather on my phone when the notification popped up from my son. "Dad, just so you know, Simone isn't comfortable with you coming to Thanksgiving this year. She needs space. Please don't make this a big thing." I sat there with my toast halfway to my mouth. I read it again, then a third time. Then I put the toast down and set my phone face down on the table, and I looked out the window at the lake, which was gray and flat that morning, and I didn't say anything out loud because there was no one to say anything to. I typed back, "Okay?" One word. I sent it and put the phone in my pocket, finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and then I drove to see my accountant. My son doesn't know this, but I had an appointment already scheduled for that afternoon, had booked it 2 weeks earlier. And when I walked into that office and sat down across from my accountant, a woman I'd trusted for 19 years, I told her what had just happened. She looked at me over her reading glasses. Then she picked up her pen and said, "All right, Ted, let's talk about what we're going to do." What we did changed everything, but I should start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Ted Ashworth. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a project manager in commercial construction, mostly in the Okanagan, some work up in Kamloops, and once a big job outside of Calgary that kept me away from home for 8 months. I retired 4 years ago, about 6 months before my wife passed away from pancreatic cancer. The timing of that, retiring just to watch her get sick, was the kind of cruelty I'd never expected from life, because up until then, life had been reasonably fair to us. We had one son, Wyatt. He's 38 now. We raised him well. I say that not to brag, but because Sandra and I genuinely worked at it. He had what he needed: sports, school trips, university paid in full at UBC Okanagan, no student debt. When he graduated, I helped him get started. When he wanted to buy his first condo, I co-signed. When that wasn't enough, I lent him $40,000 interest-free so he could make the down payment without wiping out his savings. He paid back 20 of it over the years, and I never pushed on the rest. He met Simone about 6 years ago. She's from Mississauga originally, moved out west for work, ended up at a tech company in Kelowna. She's smart, I'll say that. She has a sharpness about her that I noticed early on, a way of listening that isn't really listening so much as it's calculating. I never said anything to Sandra about that, because Sandra wanted so badly to love her, and for a while she did. Simone could be warm when she wanted to be. The wedding was 4 years ago, 8 months before Sandra died. That matters, because what came after the wedding is a different story than what came before it. Before the wedding, Wyatt still called me on Sunday afternoons. Before the wedding, we still had dinner together at least twice a month. Before the wedding, when something broke at their place, I was the first person he phoned. After the wedding, Simone reorganized things. I don't say that bitterly. I'm just telling you what happened. The Sunday calls became monthly, then occasional. The dinners became holidays only, then just Christmas and Easter. And then last year Easter was too hectic with her family visiting from Ontario. I was not invited to Easter. My son texted me about that one too. It's a pattern, the texting. Simone doesn't like confrontation, so hard news always comes in writing, through Wyatt's phone. That way no one has to hear tone of voice. No one has to look anyone in the eye. After Sandra died, I expected things to change. I expected my son to come closer, the way loss sometimes pulls people together. He did come to the funeral. He held himself together well. But within 3 weeks he was back in the city, and Simone had apparently decided that my grieving was becoming, in her word, a lot. Wyatt told me this. He said she needed him present at home, not driving out to Kelowna every other weekend. I said I understood. I think I even meant it at the time. What I didn't know then was that while I was grieving and trying to figure out how to live alone in the house, Sandra and I had shared for 22 years. My son and his wife were also making plans. Their plans involved me. They just hadn't mentioned them yet. It started the way these things always start, with a favor that doesn't look like a favor. About 14 months ago, Wyatt came by on a Saturday morning, which was unusual. He brought coffee from the good place, which was also unusual. He sat at my kitchen table and he asked me how I was doing, really doing, and I said I was managing, which was true. And then he said, carefully, like he'd practiced it, that he and Simone had been talking, and they were worried about me being alone in such a big house. The house is not that big. It's a 4-bedroom in a nice neighborhood near the Mission, backing onto a green space. Sandra and I bought it in 2003 when the market was still sane. It's paid off. It's worth, based on what similar places have sold for recently, somewhere between $800,000 and just over $1 million, depending on the month. Wyatt said maybe it was time to think about my future. I asked him what he meant by that. He said that he and Simone had been looking at options, and that there was a really nice adult lifestyle community outside of Vernon. Not a care home, he was quick to say. Not that at all, just a community, and that it might be good for me to be around people my own age, have some programming, not rattle around in this big empty house. I said the house didn't feel empty to me. He said that was part of the problem, wasn't it? Because of all the memories. I looked at him for a long moment. Wyatt has Sandra's eyes, that light greenish gray. And sitting there that morning, with his coffee cup and his careful words, he looked so much like her that it hurt. I didn't say that. I said I'd think about it. He left 45 minutes later, and I stood in my front doorway and watched his car back out of the driveway, and something had shifted in me, though I couldn't name it yet. He came back 2 weeks later with papers. Not legal documents, he said. Just information, just something to look over. But when I sat down with them that evening, I saw they were more than brochures. There were 2 documents tucked in behind the glossy photos of happy seniors playing shuffleboard. One was a power of attorney form, blank except for the signature lines. The other was a document from a real estate lawyer's office in Kelowna, a letter outlining the process of transferring a property title, specifically in situations where an elderly parent wished to simplify their estate planning. Elderly parent. I was 66. I put those documents in a drawer, and I called my accountant the next morning. Her name is Louise, and she has worked with my finances since I was in my mid-40s and trying to figure out my pension options. She is methodical and unsentimental, and she has excellent judgment. When I told her about the papers, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ted, I want you to do something for me. Don't sign anything. Don't discuss this any further with Wyatt until we've spoken to someone." Someone turned out to be a lawyer named Constance Patel, who specializes in estate planning and elder law, and who, it became clear within the first 15 minutes of our meeting, had seen versions of my situation many times before. She had a word for it. She used it gently, not accusatorially, but she used it. Financial elder abuse. She said that it existed on a spectrum, and that what was happening to me was on the earlier end of that spectrum. Not theft, not fraud, not yet, but that the documents my son had brought over were consistent with a pattern she recognized. I sat in her office with my hands in my lap, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not at that moment. Grief, actually. The same gray weight I'd carried since Sandra died, just shifted into a new shape. Constance walked me through what protections I already had and what I could put in place. She talked about independent powers of attorney, about designating someone other than a direct family member as my attorney for property. She talked about a representation agreement and what it would mean to have one that didn't include Wyatt. She was clear without being alarmist, which I appreciated. I drove home and I sat in the kitchen, in the same chair where I'd read Wyatt's Thanksgiving text 3 weeks later, and I looked at the lake. Then I went to the drawer and I took out those documents, and I did not send them back to my son. I kept them, because Constance had told me to keep everything. The Thanksgiving text arrived about 3 weeks after that second meeting with Constance. I know now that the timing was not a coincidence. What had happened in between was that Wyatt had called twice, asking whether I'd looked at the documents, and I'd told him I was still going through them, which was true in the sense that Constance was going through them. And Simone, I learned this later, from a source I'll get to, had apparently decided that my slowness meant resistance and that a harder line was needed. The text about Thanksgiving was the harder line. My son's wife didn't want me at the family dinner. She needed space. Please don't make this a big thing. I sent back, okay. Then I drove to see Louise. We sat together in her office for 2 hours that afternoon. I told her everything. The documents, the meetings with Constance, the pattern going back more than a year. Louise listened without interrupting, which is something I've always appreciated about her. When I finished, she said, "Okay, so what do you want, Ted?" I thought about that for a while. I want to make sure the house stays mine, I said. And I want my son to understand that there are consequences. Louise nodded slowly. Then let's make sure that's exactly what happens. Here is what I want to explain carefully, because I've thought about this a great deal. I did not act out of spite. I've spent a lot of time sitting with that question, asking myself honestly whether what I did was revenge or whether it was protection, and the answer is that it started as protection and then became something more. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I did first was purely defensive. Working with Constance, I set up an enduring power of attorney for property, naming Louise as my attorney rather than any family member. I updated my will, which had been equally split between Wyatt and a few charitable organizations Sandra had loved, and I revised it significantly. I set up a trust structure for the house that made any transfer without specific written consent from both Louise and a second independent trustee legally impossible without a court order. Then I did one more thing. For the past 4 years, I had been sending Wyatt and Simone a monthly e-transfer of $2,000. I started it after their second child was born, and they were stretched thin, and I kept sending it because they never mentioned stopping, and I suppose I never brought it up, because I didn't want to seem like I was holding it over them. $2,000 a month, $24,000 a year. Over the 4 years since I started, $96,000, give or take. On the Tuesday that I received the Thanksgiving text, I logged into my online banking and I canceled the recurring transfer. I did not send a message explaining this. I did not warn them. I simply stopped. Then I waited. It took 11 days. The call came on a Sunday evening. A real phone call this time, not a text, which told me the amount of alarm they were feeling. It was Wyatt's voice, but I could hear Simone in the background, and the question came quickly. Had there been a problem with the transfer? Had the bank done something? Was everything okay with my account? I said. My account was fine, thank you for asking. There was a pause. Then Wyatt said, Dad, the transfer didn't come through this month. I said, I know. Another pause. Longer. Did something change? He asked. I said yes, something had changed. I said I had spent the past several weeks doing a lot of thinking about my finances and my future, and that I had decided to restructure some things. I said I would no longer be sending the monthly transfer. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dad, we depend on that. I said I understood. I said I was sorry to hear that, because it suggested they had built their lives around money that was never guaranteed, and that I wished, for their sake, that I had been clearer about that earlier. Then he said something that I suspect he regretted the moment it left his mouth. He said, This is about Thanksgiving, isn't it? This is you punishing us. And I said, very calmly, Wyatt, you sent me a text message telling me your wife didn't want me at the family dinner. And when I looked at the papers you'd brought to my house, I had to hire a lawyer to understand what they were asking me to sign. So I suppose some things have changed, yes. The silence on the line was the loudest I've ever heard. Simone's voice in the background stopped. Wyatt said, We weren't trying to. And then he stopped. I said, I know what you were trying to do, and I want you to know that I love you, and that will always be true. But I've also spent some time with a very good lawyer, and the house is protected, and my finances are in order, and I think we should probably take some time before we speak again. He didn't respond. I said goodnight, and I hung up. I want to be honest about what the next few weeks felt like, because I think people sometimes assume that standing up for yourself feels triumphant, and sometimes it does, but not right away. Right away, it mostly just feels like loss. I'd lost my wife. I'd already been losing my son for years, in the slow way you lose someone who's still technically there. The calls that get shorter, the visits that get postponed, the holidays you're quietly uninvited from. And now that quiet loss had become a loud one, and even though I'd handled it with as much dignity as I could, I still went home to a quiet house and made dinner for one. I called my brother-in-law in Thunder Bay, Sandra's younger brother, who has always been my family more than my own family in many ways. I told him the whole story. He listened without commenting until I finished, and then he said, Ted, you know she would have done the same thing. He meant Sandra. I hadn't cried in a long time. I cried then. I should tell you about Barb, because Barb is part of why I'm even able to talk about this. About 8 months before all of this started, a neighbor of mine, widow, couple of years older than me. She lives 3 houses down on the east side, knocked on my door and asked if I'd be interested in joining a grief support group that met weekly at one of the churches on Gordon Drive. She'd been going for a few months after her husband passed, and she thought I might find it useful. I almost said no. I'm not naturally a joiner, but something made me say yes. That group saved me, in the way that quiet, ordinary things sometimes save you. It was 8 or 9 people every Thursday evening, folding chairs in a circle in a church hall, bad coffee, honest conversation. Nobody performed grief in that room. People just said what they were actually feeling, which turned out to be harder and also better than I expected. Through that group, I met a man I'll call Clifford, not his real name, but close enough that he'll know if he ever hears this. Clifford was 72, a retired school principal from West Kelowna, and he had been through something that made my situation look mild. His daughter and her husband had gotten him to sign over full power of attorney 3 years earlier, while he was recovering from surgery and wasn't thinking clearly. And by the time he understood what he'd agreed to, they had transferred $60,000 out of his account. It took a lawyer, a court application, and 14 months of legal proceedings to undo what should never have been done in the first place. So Clifford told me this one evening in the parking lot after the group, standing beside our cars in the cold. He told me because I'd mentioned vaguely that I was having some concerns about documents my son had given me. He didn't tell me to call a lawyer. He just said, "Whatever you do, don't sign anything until you understand it completely." I mean, understand it completely. I thought of Clifford when I was sitting in Constance's office. I thought of him again when I canceled that transfer. He wasn't the reason I acted, but he was the reason I acted sooner than I might have otherwise. The weeks after my phone call with Wyatt were strange and still. He called once more about 10 days later. The tone was different, less alarm, more something deflated. He said that he and Simone had talked, and that he understood why I was upset, and that he wanted to apologize for the Thanksgiving message. He said it had been handled badly. I said I appreciated that. He said he hadn't realized how much the monthly transfer had meant to their budget, and that things were going to be tight for a while. And this is where his voice went a little unsteady, that he was sorry if they'd made me feel like I wasn't important to the family. I believed the apology more than I would have expected to. I said, "Wyatt, I've loved you your whole life. That doesn't change. But I'm also not willing to be managed, and I need you to understand that what you and Simone were asking me to sign, do you even know what those documents would have done?" There was a long pause. He said he knew there was a POA involved. He said Simone had thought it was a good idea to get things organized. I said, "Those documents, combined with a property transfer letter, would have given you the legal ability to make financial and property decisions on my behalf without my consent. That's not organizing. That's control." He was quiet. "I'm not saying you understood that," I said. "I'm saying you should have." That was the hardest sentence I've ever said to my son. And also, I think, the most important. The legal documents I'd set up with Constance included something called a representation agreement, which in British Columbia governs health and personal care decisions in the event that I can no longer make them myself. I had named my brother-in-law in Thunder Bay and Louise jointly as my representatives. Not Wyatt. He found this out through the process. I had Constance send a letter informing him, not as an accusation but as a legal notification. He called after receiving it. This call was quieter than the others. He said, "You don't trust me." I said, "I trust you to love me. I'm not sure I trust the decisions you make when Simone is in the room." That was honest, and it was hard, and I'm not sure it was fair, but it was true. He didn't argue with it. Here is what I want anyone watching this to take away, because I'm not telling this story so people feel sorry for me or to put my son in a bad light forever. I'm telling it because Clifford told me his story in a parking lot in the cold, and it helped me, and maybe this helps someone. If you are a senior, and someone in your family is bringing you documents to sign, any documents, even ones that look routine, even ones that come with coffee and a nice visit, you do not have to sign them. You have the right to take them to your own lawyer, someone who represents only you, before you agree to anything. This is not distrust. This is common sense. A power of attorney is a powerful legal tool. In the wrong circumstances, it can be misused. An independent lawyer can explain what you are agreeing to and whether the arrangement protects your interests or someone else's. In British Columbia, There are resources through the public guardian and trustee that can help. Organizations like BC's Seniors Advocate Office exist specifically for situations like mine. I didn't know about any of them until I was sitting in Constance's office. I wish I'd known earlier. The monthly transfer I'd been sending, that was my own choice to make, and when it no longer made sense, that was also my choice. But money given freely is different from money taken without understanding. I got to make that distinction. Not everyone does. It's been about 9 months now since that Thanksgiving text. Wyatt and I have spoken a handful of times. The conversations are careful, not warm, but they are honest in a way that our conversations hadn't been for a long time before any of this. He and Simone are managing their finances differently. I don't know the details and I don't ask. I was not at Thanksgiving. I was not at Christmas either, though he did call on Christmas morning, which was something. I made dinner here, at my own table, with my brother-in-law and his wife who drove down from Thunder Bay, which was an 8-hour drive and a kindness I won't forget. I still go to the Thursday group at the church on Gordon Drive. The coffee is still bad. I still sit in the same folding chair. Clifford isn't coming as regularly since he started volunteering with a seniors advocacy group. He seems lighter these days, which is good. The house on the Mission is still mine. The lake is still gray some mornings and blue on others. I still have my second cup of coffee every morning, still the dark roast from the shop on Bernard Avenue. I think about Sandra a lot. I think she'd be furious at some of what happened, and I think she'd also be a little proud of how I handled it. She always said I was too soft with Wyatt. She was right, the way she was right about most things. I don't know what the future looks like with my son. I hope it gets warmer. I think the honesty we found in those hard phone calls is a better foundation than the politeness we had before, even if the politeness was easier to live inside. What I know is that I'm still here, still making my own decisions, still sitting at my own table, in my own house, looking out at my own lake, and that, it turns out, is enough.